They thought they could control me. The HOA had already sent threats, fines, and letters, but nothing prepared me for what happened next. One evening, as the sun set behind my gate, I noticed shadows, figures waiting, watching, refusing to leave. Hours passed, and the tension grew heavier with every minute. Why were they here? What did they want from me? And more importantly, how far was I willing to go to protect my home, my land, and my freedom? Life in the neighborhood wasn't perfect, but for a long time it felt peaceful enough. The street was lined with tidy lawns, kids riding their bikes in the afternoons, and neighbors who waved politely as they carried groceries from their cars. My home sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, a little further from the noise, with a wide gate that opened up to the land I had worked for years to afford. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. Every corner, every stone, every tree had meaning. For years, I kept to myself. I wasn't the type to gossip over fences or host loud parties. My satisfaction came from the quiet moments, sipping coffee on the porch, fixing things around the property, or welcoming old friends when they visited. I believed that if I respected my neighbors, they would respect me in return. That's how community was supposed to work. At first, the HOA seemed harmless, even helpful. They called themselves the Guardians of Neighborhood Standards. Their newsletters bragged about keeping property values high, organizing seasonal decorations, and ensuring everyone followed the rules. On the surface, it sounded like order, but I would soon learn that their version of order came at a cost. The first hints were subtle. A letter tucked into my mailbox reminding me that my grass needed trimming. A warning about the color of my front gate not perfectly matching the approved palette. A neighbor casually mentioning that the HOA board had been talking about enforcing stricter rules for people on the edge of the community, which happened to be me. I brushed it off at first. After all, I wasn't breaking any real laws. I kept my property clean, paid my dues, and minded my own business. But the letters didn't stop. The notices grew sharper in tone, as if someone on that board had decided I was their personal target. And the strangest part, I couldn't figure out why. I wasn't the loudest, the messiest, or the most difficult neighbor. So what made me the problem in their eyes? Looking back, maybe it was the gate. Maybe it was the independence my land represented. The idea that I wasn't as tightly bound to their control as others were. Whatever it was, it became clear that I was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. At first, I tried to ignore the HOA's letters. I thought maybe if I didn't react, they'd get bored and move on to someone else. But instead, the pressure grew worse. What started as mild warnings turned into full-blown accusations. They said my grass was 1 inch above regulation length. They claimed my security lights were too bright and disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. They even accused me of storing unauthorized equipment on my own property, when all I had was a trailer parked discreetly behind the fence. It wasn't about rules anymore, it was about power. The HOA sent official-looking envelopes stamped with fines, $50 here, $100 there, piling up week after week. And with each notice, the language became colder, more aggressive. They threatened liens. They threatened legal action. They acted like they owned my land, as if my years of hard work meant nothing compared to their self-appointed authority. At night, I started noticing cars slowing down in front of my property. Sometimes they idled with their lights off, just sitting there. Other times, I'd see someone standing at the end of the driveway, scribbling notes on a clipboard. When I walked toward them, they'd scatter like shadows, disappearing into the dark. It felt less like neighborhood watch and more like surveillance. I confronted one of them once, a board member I recognized from the last meeting I attended. He didn't apologize or explain. He just smirked and told me, "We're making sure you're in compliance. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." That's when I realized this wasn't just about grass, paint colors, or rules. This was personal. Someone on that board wanted to break me.
The breaking point came with the fence. My gate was solid steel, painted black and built to last. It stood as the boundary between my home and theirs. But one morning I found a notice nailed directly onto it. Unapproved structure, must be removed within 30 days. Removed? The gate that had been standing for years before half of these people even moved in? I laughed at first, thinking it had been a mistake. But when I called, the HOA president himself answered. His voice dripped with arrogance as he told me, "Rules are rules. If you don't comply, we'll handle it for you." That's when I realized this wasn't just about grass, paint colors, or rules. This was personal. Someone on that board wanted to break me. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every late-night visitor with a clipboard. I kept photos, timestamps, and even video recordings of cars circling my home like vultures. If they wanted a fight, I was going to make sure I had proof. But even as I prepared myself, they escalated further. One Saturday morning, I woke up to find strangers standing at my gate. Not neighbors, not even board members, but uniformed guards the HOA had apparently hired. They weren't police, but they carried radios and wore matching black jackets with "Compliance Security" printed on the back. They stood there, arms crossed, blocking the entrance like I was some kind of criminal in my own home. They didn't speak, they didn't move, they just waited. For hours. At first I thought maybe they'd leave after making their point, but when the sun set and they were still there, it became clear this was intimidation, plain and simple. They wanted me to break, they wanted me to lose my temper, step out, and give them an excuse to call the police. And here's the thing, I almost did. My hands shook with rage as I paced back and forth inside. My heart pounded in my chest. Who did they think they were? How could a group of neighbors playing HOA board justify posting guards at someone's private property? But then, just when I was about to snap, help arrived. It wasn't from the police. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was from my past. Because you see, years ago, before I bought this home, before I settled into this quiet neighborhood, I served alongside people who knew what loyalty meant. People who didn't back down in the face of threats. People who had faced far worse than an HOA. That night, I called a few of them, men I trusted with my life, and when they heard what was happening, they didn't hesitate. They said, "We'll be there."
The next day, just as those so-called guards were lining up outside again, a different kind of presence rolled in. Trucks pulled up, doors slammed, and out stepped my old Marine buddies. Not in uniform, but you didn't need a uniform to recognize their discipline, their strength, their authority. The HOA guards shifted uncomfortably. They hadn't expected this. They were used to scaring families, intimidating retirees, sending parents into quiet compliance. But this time, they were facing men who had lived through battles and weren't about to be bullied by a neighborhood committee. The air grew thick with tension. My friends stood tall, calm, but unshakable, as if daring the so-called security to make a move. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in the eyes of the HOA's hired muscle. And yet, the board didn't back down, not right away. They sent more letters, more threats, more demands. They even tried to paint me as dangerous to the community, twisting the story to make it look like I was the aggressor, the problem, the one out of control. The cracks in their power were beginning to show. Still, I knew this was only the beginning, because if there's one thing about people drunk on control, it's that they don't give it up easily. And I could feel it in my bones. The biggest clash was still ahead. The breaking point came one hot afternoon when the HOA finally decided to make their move in the open. It started like any other day, letters in the mailbox, threats stacked on top of threats. But when I walked outside, I froze. At the end of my driveway, 3 trucks had pulled up. Out stepped more of those so-called compliance guards, But this time, they weren't just standing there. They were carrying tools, broke bars, bolt cutters. One of them even had a portable saw strapped to his shoulder. And right behind them stood two board members, smug expressions plastered on their faces, clipboards in hand like generals about to oversee a conquest. Their target? My gate. The one they had ordered me to remove, the one I had refused to tear down, the one that marked the line between what was mine and what they wanted to claim. I could feel my chest tighten, anger mixing with disbelief. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was trespassing. This was theft. They were about to rip apart what I had built with my own two hands on my own property. I stormed out, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "Step away from that gate!" The guards froze for half a second, but the board president smirked, waving his clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. "You're out of compliance. This structure is being removed today. You had your chance." That's when the standoff began. Behind me, I heard engines rumble, the sound of trucks pulling up the gravel road. My friends, the Marines I had called days before. They didn't run, they didn't shout, they walked forward with quiet, unshakable confidence. Their presence alone enough to tilt the balance of power. The HOA guards exchanged nervous glances. Their tools suddenly looked ridiculous, like children's toys in the hands of men who had never faced real resistance. My friends didn't even have to speak. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder at my gate, a wall of calm, immovable strength.
But the board president wouldn't back down. He puffed up his chest and barked orders. "Proceed! Cut it down!" The guards hesitated. One lifted the bolt cutters, then froze again as my friend stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a steady, unblinking stare. The kind of stare that told him, "You really don't want to do this." The silence was thick, every second stretching into eternity. I could feel the neighbors gathering down the street, drawn by the spectacle. Curtains shifted, doors opened, phones came out, recording every moment. And then, the board president made his biggest mistake. He grabbed the bolt cutters himself. He marched forward, hands shaking with the need to prove his power, and clamped them around the lock of my gate. The metallic clink echoed like a gunshot. I stepped forward, planting myself between him and the steel. My voice was low, but it carried. "Touch that lock, and you'll answer for trespassing on private property." For the first time, I saw his smirk falter. He opened his mouth, ready to argue, but before he could speak, the roar of another engine broke through the tension. A county sheriff's SUV rolled up the street. The HOA board froze. The guards stiffened. The neighbors whispered louder, phones now pointed in every direction. The sheriff stepped out, sunglasses glinting in the sun, and slowly walked toward the scene. "Someone want to explain what's going on here?" he asked. The HOA president practically tripped over himself rushing forward. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man is in violation of HOA regulations. We've issued fines, notices, and orders. Today, we are enforcing removal of this non-compliant structure." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He turned toward me. "Sir, is that true?" I handed him the thick folder I'd been carrying for weeks. Every letter, every fine, every photo, every recording of their harassment. "No, officer. What's true is that these men are trespassing on private property, damaging private structures, and threatening me with unlawful force. Everything you need is in there." The sheriff flipped through the paperwork, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he looked back at the president. "Do you have a court order?" "What? No. We don't need a court order. We're the HOA." The sheriff cut him off. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. "You don't set foot on someone's property and start tearing things down without a court order. That's criminal trespass. That's destruction of property. And if you don't back off right now, I'll start writing charges." The silence that followed was deafening. The president's face turned red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air.
The guards lowered their tools, suddenly very interested in stepping back toward their trucks. The neighbors, oh, the neighbors, they began to murmur, some even laughing quietly as the so-called guardians of the neighborhood were dressed down in front of everyone. My friends didn't move. They stood like a wall behind me, calm and steady, while the HOA board crumbled in the spotlight. The president tried one last time, his voice cracking. "This isn't over." The sheriff leaned in close, his words low but sharp enough to cut steel. "You're right, it isn't. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you just tried to commit a crime in broad daylight. I suggest you leave before I decide to put cuffs on you." And just like that, the mighty HOA, the ones who thought they could find me, threaten me, surround my property with guards, scattered. Trucks started, doors slammed, and one by one they disappeared down the street, leaving nothing but dust and the echoes of their humiliation.
The neighbors clapped. Some cheered. For the first time, I saw the community not as silent witnesses, but as allies who had finally seen the truth. The board wasn't protecting them. They were bullying them. And now, exposed in the light, their power looked pitiful, desperate, broken. As the sheriff handed me back my folder, he gave a slow nod. "You did the right thing, documenting all this. Keep holding on to it. Something tells me this fight isn't finished yet." And he was right. Because while that battle was won, the war with the HOA wasn't over. They'd been humiliated, but humiliation has a way of breeding revenge. And I knew, deep in my bones, that their next move wouldn't just be about me. It would be about the entire neighborhood. And when that storm came, I would be ready. When the dust settled after that dramatic showdown, the entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers of what had just happened. For years, the HOA had ruled with intimidation and silence. People complied because they were too afraid to fight back. But now everyone had seen it. The board humiliated in front of their own community, called out by law enforcement, and forced to retreat like cowards. In the days that followed, something strange happened. My phone started ringing. Not from the board, but from neighbors. Some were cautious, almost embarrassed, as if they'd been waiting for someone else to stand up before they dared speak. Others were bold, angry even, venting about years of harassment, unnecessary fines, and ridiculous rules they had endured in silence. One neighbor, an elderly widow down the street, confessed that the board had fined her for having too many wind chimes hanging from her porch. Another admitted they had been charged hundreds of dollars because their seasonal decorations didn't fit community guidelines. Families whispered about threats of liens, about being told they couldn't park their own cars in their own driveways, about being bullied into repainting entire houses over shades of paint nearly identical to the approved palette. I realized in that moment that this wasn't just my fight anymore. This was a neighborhood held hostage by a small group of power-hungry individuals who had mistaken control for leadership. And word traveled fast. Within a week, the next HOA meeting was packed wall to wall. Neighbors who hadn't attended in years showed up, their arms crossed, their faces hard with frustration. I didn't go alone. My friends stood with me, not as an army, but as a symbol that we wouldn't be bullied anymore. Cameras were rolling, phones were recording, and the board members looked like deer caught in headlights. The president tried to regain control, banging his gavel and reciting rules, but the room had shifted. People weren't afraid anymore. They asked hard questions. They demanded financial transparency. They wanted to know where the thousands of dollars in compliance fines had gone, why the HOA had hired private guards, and why board members thought they had the right to trespass on private property without court orders.
And with every question, the board stuttered, dodged, or flat out lied, and the crowd knew it. Then came the turning point. A neighbor who worked in local government stood up and read aloud the actual state laws governing HOAs, laws that limited their powers, laws that clearly stated they had overstepped every boundary. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, even shouts. The board's arrogance cracked under the weight of exposure. One member resigned on the spot, slipping out a side door while neighbors jeered. Another tried to defend the necessity of order, but was shouted down by people who were done being controlled. And me? I didn't need to say much. I stood there with my folder of evidence, the same one I had handed to the sheriff, and told them calmly, "This is just the beginning. If you keep abusing your power, every piece of it will be exposed." The board president's face turned pale. For the first time, I saw fear instead of smugness. He knew his reign was over.
In the weeks that followed, the community voted. Not only did we strip the abusive members of their positions, but we also restructured the entire HOA. Rules were simplified, fines were capped, and transparency became mandatory. The stranglehold of control loosened, and for the first time in years, people felt free in their own homes again. But victories like this don't come without scars. For months, I lived with the lingering tension of what if? What if the HOA tried to retaliate legally? What if some board members held grudges and found new ways to make my life difficult? What if the community fractured instead of healing? And yet, what happened was the opposite. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down began standing up for one another. We built real connections, not forced by rules, but born from shared struggle. I watched people who had barely spoken before suddenly stop to chat on sidewalks, offer help with repairs, or invite each other over for barbecues. The very thing the HOA had claimed to protect, community spirit, was finally alive, but only because their false version of control had been torn down.
As for me, I learned something powerful. I had always thought of my gate as just steel and hinges, a boundary between me and the rest of the world. But it had become something more. It was a symbol of independence, of standing firm, of refusing to be pushed around by people who confuse authority with entitlement. And every time I walked past it, still standing strong despite their attempts to destroy it, I felt a quiet pride. Of course, there were lingering battles. The old board president tried to save face, spreading rumors about me, calling me dangerous or unstable. But the truth was stronger than his lies. People had seen what he tried to do. They had watched him fail. And eventually, even his whispers faded into irrelevance. The HOA never fully disappeared. No community ever completely escapes them. But the power shifted. It was no longer a weapon wielded by a few. It became a tool managed by many. And while there were still disagreements, still moments of frustration, it was nothing like before. Looking back now, I realized the most important part of this fight wasn't about me or even the HOA. It was about showing people that they didn't have to live in fear, that they could push back against unfairness, that sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to back down to give others the courage to do the same. And isn't that the irony? The HOA thought they could isolate me, break me, make an example out of me. Instead, they exposed themselves. Instead, they united the neighborhood in a way they never could. Instead, they lost everything. So when I sit on my porch now, sipping coffee as the sun rises, I can't help but ask myself, how many other neighborhoods are trapped under the same kind of petty tyranny? How many families are paying fines they don't deserve,
obeying rules that make no sense, and living in fear of a knock on the door from their so-called community leaders. And more importantly, how long will it take before they decide enough is enough? Because if there's one thing this battle taught me, it's that power only works if people surrender to it. The moment you stand firm, the moment you shine a light on abuse, the illusion crumbles. And when it crumbles, the people finally remember what freedom in their own homes is supposed to feel like.